Roasted garlic's smell was always ruined by the copper tang of blood. Staring down at the bruised, trembling woman huddled on his kitchen's imported Tuscan tiles, Jason wiped a smudge of flour from his tailored slacks. One of her eyes was swelling shut, and her lip was split. Panting, the two debt collectors who had dragged her through the alley door were still grinning like they'd won something. Jason didn't reach for his gun. He simply looked at his sous chef and said, "Bring her to me," causing the kitchen to go dead quiet. Jason Vitiello demanded two things in his life: absolute loyalty in the streets and perfect acidity in his tomato sauce. L'Osteria di Vitiello was not a front. It was his sanctuary. The back room handled the illicit ledgers of the city's underground port shipments, yes, but the dining room was sacred. Out there, the clinking of heavy silver forks against porcelain, the low murmur of wealthy patrons, and the rich, heavy scent of browned butter and sage formed a barrier between Jason and the brutal reality of his actual profession. He was standing by the stainless steel prep tables, watching Leo, his head chef, slice a filet mignon with the precision of a surgeon. The kitchen was a machine, hot, humid, smelling of sweat olive oil and baking bread. Then the rhythm broke. It wasn't a subtle shift. It was the harsh metallic slam of the heavy steel alley doors being kicked open. A gust of cold, damp November air sucked the heat out of the room, bringing with it the smell of wet asphalt and rotting garbage. Jason didn't flinch. He just slowly turned his head. A body hit the floorboards with a sickening wet thud. It was Clara. She was a waitress here, mid-20s quiet, usually invisible. She had a habit of tying her dark hair back with a cheap plastic clip that always seemed to be snapping, and her uniform was usually a size too big. She kept her head down. She didn't ask questions when men in heavy coats walked past the kitchen into Jason's private office. That was why she still had a job. Right now she wasn't invisible. She was a heap of limbs on the floor. Two men stepped into the light of the kitchen. They weren't Jason's men. They were wearing cheap leather jackets, smelling of stale beer and cheap cigarettes. O'Connor's crew, South Side Muscle. One of them, a heavy-set man with a flat nose, kicked Clara in the ribs. It wasn't a movie kick. It was a dull, heavy impact. Clara didn't scream. She just let out a sharp, breathless grunt and curled tighter into a ball, her hands desperately trying to cover her face. "Told you we'd find you, you stupid bitch," the flat-nosed man spat. "Think you can dodge Jimmy?" The kitchen staff froze. The line cooks, usually a loud, chaotic bunch, stood like statues, their eyes darting from the thugs to Jason. The only sound was the hiss of a pan catching fire on the stove and Clara's wet, ragged breathing. Jason felt a twitch in his jaw. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but Leo the chef stepped back, instantly lowering his knife. Jason hated messes. He hated unpredictability. But more than anything, he hated someone bringing their filth into his clean house. He stepped out from the shadow of the hanging copper pots. The heels of his leather Oxfords clicked sharply against the tile. The two thugs looked up their bravado, faltering for a fraction of a second as they recognized the man in the charcoal suit. Jason wasn't a large man, not towering or overly muscled, but he carried a stillness that made the air around him feel thin and hard to breathe. "You're tracking mud," Jason said. His voice was quiet, conversational. It barely carried over the hiss of the forgotten pawn. The flat-nosed man swallowed hard. "Vitiello, this ain't your business. This bitch owes our boss 10 grand. We're just collecting." Jason didn't look at the men. He looked down at Clara. She was pushing herself up on one elbow. Her white uniform shirt was torn at the collar, revealing an angry red scrape across her collarbone. Her lip was split wide open, blood pooling in the corner of her mouth and dripping in thick, heavy drops onto the pristine white tile. Her right eye was already puffing up, turning a nasty shade of violet. She looked up at Jason. There was no plea in her eyes, no begging, just a dull, exhausted resignation. She looked like a stray dog that was used to being kicked, simply waiting for the next boot to fall. It bothered him. It bothered him a lot. 10 grand, Jason repeated softly. He finally looked at the thug. And you thought the best way to collect was to bleed her on my floor during dinner service. Jimmy said, I don't care what Jimmy said. Jason's voice dropped a fraction of an octave. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet with it. He looked at Leo. The chef was already gripping a heavy cast-iron skillet, waiting for the nod. But Jason shook his head slightly. He didn't want a bloodbath in the kitchen. The health inspector was due next week. Jason looked back down at the girl. She was shivering now, the shock wearing off the pain settling into her bones. The contrast of her blood against his white tiles was a glaring insult. Bring her to me, Jason said, his eyes never leaving Clara's. He turned on his heel and walked toward the back hallway. He didn't look back to see if his orders were followed. He didn't have to. The heavy thud of fists against flesh, followed by the dragging of 2 unconscious bodies out of the back door, echoed down the hall, just as he unlocked the heavy oak door to his office. The office smelled of old paper lemon furniture polish and the faint, lingering ghost of cigar smoke trapped in the heavy velvet curtains. The hum of the city was completely blocked out by the soundproofed walls. Clara sat on the edge of a Chesterfield leather sofa. She felt ridiculous. She was ruining the upholstery. Her whole body throbbed with a synchronized heavy ache. Her ribs burned with every shallow breath, and the metallic taste of blood coated her tongue, thick and nauseating. She pressed a damp, cold bar towel against her split lip, wincing at the sting. Jason sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a glass of water in his hand. He hadn't offered her anything. He was just watching her. Clara shifted her wet shoes, squeaking slightly on the hardwood floor. She hated the silence. She was used to screaming to threats to the loud, chaotic violence of her life. This quiet, clinical observation was terrifying. It felt like being under a microscope. You're bleeding on the leather, Jason noted. His tone wasn't angry, just observant. Clara stiffened. She hurriedly tried to scoot forward, hovering awkwardly on the edge of the seat. I'm sorry. I can stand. Sit down, Clara. She froze. He knew her name. Of course he did. He owned the place. But hearing it in that low, raspy baritone made her stomach clench. Jason Vitiello wasn't just a restaurant owner. Everyone in the North End knew who he was. He was the man you went to when the police couldn't help. He was the man who made people disappear. And she had just brought Jimmy O'Connor's filth to his doorstep. I'll quit, Clara blurted out the words, muffled by the towel. You don't have to fire me. I'm gone. I won't bring this back here. Jason took a slow sip of his water. The ice clinked against the crystal glass. You owe Jimmy O'Connor $10,000. It wasn't a question. Clara looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were white, trembling. My ex-boyfriend, she muttered, the bitterness leaking through her exhaustion. He took a loan in my name, gambled it, ran away to Florida. Jimmy decided since my name is on the paper, I'm the one who bleeds. And you let him? Clara snapped her head up, glaring at him through her one good eye. Let him. Do I look like I have a choice? Mr. Vitiello, I serve pasta for $12 an hour, plus tips. I don't have 10 grand. I don't have $10 to spare at the end of the month. She braced herself, expecting a slap reprimand for her tone. You didn't snap at a Mafia boss, but Jason just tilted his head. He looked almost bored, but his dark eyes were sharp, tracking the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the defensive set of her shoulders. "You're defensive," he said. "Good. Means you're not broken yet." He stood up the movement, slow and deliberate. Clara instinctively shrank back into the sofa, the pain in her ribs flaring as her muscles tensed. Jason noticed the flinch. He stopped halfway across the room. "I am not going to hit you," he said, his voice dropping the conversational tone, becoming something harder, heavier. "If I wanted you hurt, I would have left you in the alley." "Why didn't you?" Clara asked. Her voice cracked. She hated how weak she sounded. "I'm nobody. I'm just a liability to you." Jason walked to a small wooden cabinet in the corner of the room. He opened it, revealing a well-stocked first aid kit. He pulled out a bottle of rubbing alcohol, some gauze and medical tape. "You work for me," Jason said, turning back to her. He set the supplies on the coffee table in front of her. "Nobody touches what belongs to me. Not in my restaurant. Not on my property." Clara stared at the medical supplies. "I'm not property." "Tonight you are," Jason replied smoothly. He unscrewed the cap of the rubbing alcohol. The sharp chemical smell filled the space between them. "Give me the towel." Clara hesitated. She didn't want him near her. She didn't want anyone touching her. But the look in his eyes wasn't a request. She slowly lowered the blood-soaked towel from her mouth. Jason soaked a piece of gauze in the alcohol. He leaned in close. He smelled like expensive wool, faint garlic, and a sharp metallic undertone that Clara recognized instantly. Gun oil. "This is going to burn," he stated matter-of-factly. He pressed the gauze to her split lip. Clara hissed, her eyes watering instantly as the pain flared white-hot across her face. She tried to pull back, but Jason's hand shot out his fingers, wrapping around the back of her neck. His grip was entirely firm, immovable, yet strangely devoid of violence. It was a grip meant to hold her in place, not to hurt her. His thumb rested against her pulse point, feeling the frantic rabbit-like beat of her heart. "Hold still," he murmured, his face inches from hers. She forced herself to stop fighting. She squeezed her eyes shut, breathing heavily through her nose. Jason's movements were precise, efficient. He cleaned the blood from her lip, then moved to the angry scrape on her collarbone. For a man whose hands were built for violence, his touch was unnervingly steady. There was no gentleness in it. Gentleness implied care, and Jason was simply performing a necessary task, but there was a carefulness that confused her. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, opening her eyes. He was so close she could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the hard, unyielding line of his mouth. "Because a bleeding waitress is bad for business," he replied, his gaze focused on the tape he was cutting. Clara let out a short, cynical bark of a laugh that ended in a groan as her ribs protested. "Right. The bottom line." Jason finished taping the gauze over the cut on her collarbone. He leaned back, wiping his hands on a clean towel. He looked at her work. She looked terrible. Half her face was swollen, her clothes were ruined, and she was shaking like a leaf. But there was a hard, stubborn light in her remaining good eye. She wasn't crying. "Jimmy O'Connor is a problem," Jason said, tossing the bloody gauze into a metal trash can. "He thinks because my uncle died, the North End is soft. He thinks he can send his dogs into my kitchen and I'll just mop up the blood." Clara wrapped her arms around her stomach. "He'll come back. If not tonight, tomorrow. They won't stop until they get the money." Jason sat back down behind his desk. He picked up his glass of water, his eyes cold and dark. "No," Jason said quietly. "They won't come back." The grandfather clock in the corner of the office ticked loudly a heavy rhythmic sound that seemed to sync with the throbbing in Clara's skull. It was past midnight. The restaurant above them was closed, the last of the staff dismissed. Jason had spent the last 20 minutes on the phone. He spoke in rapid, hushed Italian. Clara didn't speak the language, but she understood the tone. It was the tone of a man orchestrating a demolition. When he finally hung up the receiver, the silence in the room felt heavier. "It's done," Jason said, leaning back in his chair. He laced his fingers together over his stomach. Jimmy's bookie operation in the South End is currently burning to the ground. His 2 men who touched you are in a shipping container, headed for a very long, very dark boat ride. Clara felt a cold chill wash over her. She stared at him, her breath catching. He said it so casually, like he had just ordered a different cut of meat from the butcher. You killed them," she asked, her voice a hollow whisper. Jason's expression didn't change. "I removed a nuisance. Don't flatter yourself, Clara. I didn't do it for you. I did it because O'Connor crossed a line. But the debt—" She started, panic rising in her throat. Jimmy O'Connor was a monster. If Jason just burned down his operation, Jimmy would come looking for blood. Her blood. "The debt is handled," Jason interrupted. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "O'Connor understands now that you are under my jurisdiction. He won't look in your direction again. If he does, I won't just burn his buildings." Clara should have felt relieved. The crushing weight of the $10,000, the constant looking over her shoulder, the fear of the alleyways, it was gone. Snapped out of existence by a phone call. But looking at the man across from her, she didn't feel free. She felt like she had just stepped out of a cage and into a vault. She slowly stood up. Her legs were shaky, her knees feeling like water. "Thank you," she managed to say. It tasted like ash in her mouth. I'll figure out a way to pay you back. I can work double shifts. You can't afford me on $12 an hour, Clara," Jason said dryly. "Then what do you want?" She snapped, exhaustion stripping away her filter. "You just saved my life, apparently, to protect your ego. You just declared war on a South Side crew over a waitress. What's the catch? What do I owe you now?" Jason watched her. The raw defiance in her posture was fascinating. Most people would be kissing his ring, crying tears of gratitude, begging to clean his floors. She was just looking for the trap. She was smart. "You owe me $10,000, Jason stated, his voice flat. "I don't do charity. I bought your debt." Clara let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Of course. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss." Jason's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I am nothing like Jimmy O'Connor. I don't send goons to beat women in alleyways. I don't charge exorbitant interest rates that ensure you die in poverty." "Then how do I pay you?" She challenged, her hands on her bruised hips. "You'll continue to work here," Jason said. "But not as a waitress. You're moving to the office. You're going to help Leo with the inventory, the legitimate bookkeeping. You'll work directly under me." Clara frowned, confused. "Bookkeeping, I don't know anything about that." "You'll learn. It pays $25 an hour. Half goes to your debt. Half goes to your pocket." Jason picked up a pen, rolling it between his fingers. "And until things cool down with O'Connor, you are not going back to your apartment." Clara's heart spiked. "What? No. I have to go home. All my things. Ooh, your apartment is a ground floor walk-up with a broken fire escape and a lock I could pick with a paperclip," Jason recited smoothly. "O'Connor might be scared, but he's also stupid. I won't risk my investment getting a bullet in her head because she wanted to sleep in her own bed." "Your investment?" Clara echoed, feeling a sickening plunge in her stomach. Jason stood up. He walked around the desk, stopping just a few feet away from her. He was taller than she realized when he was this close. The sheer gravity of his presence made the hair on her arms stand up. "You are my responsibility now, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet hum that vibrated in the air between them. "I paid for you. I bled men for you. You will stay in the apartment upstairs. It's secure. It's clean." Clara looked up into his face. There was no lust in his eyes, no predatory gleam. It was purely possessive, territorial. She was a broken thing he had found on his floor, and he had decided he owned her now. "I don't have a choice, do I?" she whispered, feeling the last bit of her adrenaline drain away, leaving her hollow and exhausted. Jason reached out. Clara flinched again, but he only reached past her, picking up a heavy brass key from a small hook on the wall. He held it out to her. The metal was cold. "There's always a choice, Clara," Jason said quietly. "You can take the key, go upstairs, lock the door and sleep safely. Or you can walk out the front door and see how long you last on the street with Jimmy O'Connor's bruised ego." Clara stared at the key. It was heavy in his palm. The ridges of the brass caught the dim light of the desk lamp. She wasn't stupid. She knew she was trading one form of captivity for another. Jason Vitiello was dangerous. He was a killer. But looking at the cold, hard lines of his face, she realized something else. He was a killer who had taped her bandages and offered her a safe room. Clara reached out. Her fingers brushed against his palm. His skin was rough, calloused, unexpectedly warm. She closed her hand around the key. "Upstairs," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Jason's jaw tightened. A flash of something, approval perhaps, or maybe just satisfaction, crossed his dark eyes. "Leah will bring you some food," Jason said, turning away, dismissing her. He walked back to his desk, picking up a stack of invoices, as if the last hour hadn't happened. "Don't bleed on the sheets. They're Egyptian cotton." Clara didn't say another word. She turned and walked toward the heavy oak door, her ribs screaming with every step. She stepped out into the dark, silent hallway, clutching the brass key so tightly it bit into her palm. The pain was grounding. It reminded her that she was still alive. For now, the lock engaged with a heavy, oiled click that echoed in the empty stairwell. Clara stood in the entryway of the apartment, her hand still resting on the deadbolt. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to. The ambient orange glow from the street lamps outside filtered through the sheer curtains, casting long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor. The air in the room was completely still. It smelled of cedarwood expensive floor wax, and a faint trace of ozone, like the air after a violent summer storm. It didn't smell like him. That was a small mercy. She took a step forward, her cheap sneakers leaving a faint, damp smudge on the pristine wood. The apartment was stripped of personality. A massive bed dominated the center of the room, piled high with thick grey duvets. A sleek leather armchair sat in the corner. There were no photographs, no books. It looked like a high-end hotel room waiting for a ghost. Clara didn't go to the bed. The thought of sinking into that vast, soft expanse felt like a trap. It was too vulnerable. Instead, she walked to the far corner of the room, wedged herself between the heavy oak dresser and the wall, and slid down to the floor. Her ribs screamed in protest as her knees pulled up to her chest. She wrapped her arms tightly around her shins, resting her uninjured cheek on her knees. The adrenaline was finally gone, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion that made her teeth chatter. She was alive. Jimmy's men were gone. But as she sat in the suffocating quiet of Jason Vitiello's property, the reality of her transaction settled into her bones like damp concrete. She closed her eyes. The copper smell of her own blood still clung to her clothes, mixing sickeningly with the cedar. She didn't sleep. She just drifted in a tense, shallow state of hyper-awareness, waiting for the heavy tread of footsteps on the stairs. They never came. Dawn broke not with sunlight, but with a flat, grey, northeastern chill that seeped through the window panes. Clara uncurled herself slowly. Every joint popped. The right side of her face was tight and hot to the touch. When she finally forced herself to her feet, a wave of nausea hit her so hard she had to grip the edge of the dresser to keep from going down again. She found the bathroom. It was a sterile expanse of white marble and glass. She avoided the mirror above the sink. She didn't want to see what O'Connor's men had reduced her to, and she didn't want to see the woman who had agreed to become collateral. She stripped off her ruined uniform. The fabric stuck to the dried blood on her shoulder, tearing the scrape open again. She hissed, biting down on her swollen lip. Turning on the shower, she stepped under the spray. It wasn't a relaxing shower. The water pressure was heavy, almost aggressive. It stung the cut on her collarbone and sent sharp, localized jolts of pain through her bruised ribs. She scrubbed her skin with a bar of unscented soap until it was raw, watching the pale pink water spiral down the heavy chrome drain. She wanted to wash the alley off. She wanted to wash the memory of Jason's calloused thumb against her pulse point away. Neither worked. When she stepped out, wrapping a heavy, obscenely soft towel around her shivering frame, there was a sharp knock at the main door. Clara froze. The wet tile was freezing under her bare feet. "Clara!" It was Leo's voice. Gruff. Tired. "I'm leaving a box. Boss wants you downstairs in 20. She waited until she heard his heavy boots retreat down the stairs before cracking the door open. A pristine white cardboard box sat on the welcome mat. Next to it was a steaming paper cup of espresso and a flaky, butter-soaked cornetto wrapped in a napkin. She pulled the items inside, locking the door immediately. Inside the box were clothes. They weren't extravagant, and they certainly weren't meant to be seductive. A pair of dark, tailored slacks, a crisp white button-down shirt made of thick cotton, and a simple black cardigan. They were severe, utilitarian. The uniform of a woman who worked in a back office. Underneath the clothes lay a pair of black leather loafers. Jason hadn't guessed her size. He had deduced it. Perfectly. She dressed quickly. The stiff cotton of the shirt rubbed uncomfortably against the gauze on her shoulder, but the clothes fit like armor. She drank the espresso in 3 bitter, scalding gulps. She ignored the pastry. Her stomach was a tight, twisted knot that would reject anything solid. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the mirror. Her right eye was a swollen, dark purple slit. Her lip was a jagged line of crusted red under the medical tape. She looked like a car crash. She ran a brush through her damp hair, tying it back with a fresh elastic she found in the bathroom drawer. She didn't try to cover the bruises with makeup. There was no point in hiding the damage from the man who had watched it happen. Clara opened the door and walked down the stairs to pay her debt. The restaurant was empty and entirely silent, devoid of the chaotic energy of the dinner service. The chairs were flipped upside down on the tables, and the smell of bleach overpowered the lingering scent of garlic. Clara walked straight to the heavy oak door in the back hallway. She didn't knock. He had bought her time. He expected her to be there. She turned the brass knob and pushed. Jason was already at his desk. He was wearing a different suit, navy blue. Today, the tie loosened slightly at the collar. A pair of reading glasses rested low on the bridge of his nose. He didn't look up as she entered. "You're late. 2 minutes," he stated. His fountain pen scratched aggressively against thick paper. I couldn't walk very fast, Clara replied flatly. She closed the door behind her, the heavy thud sealing them in the soundproofed room. Jason finally looked up. His dark eyes flicked over her, taking in the severe clothes, the wet hair, and the glaring, angry bruises painting her face. He betrayed absolutely nothing. No pity, no satisfaction. Just clinical assessment. "The desk in the corner," he said, gesturing with the pen. "Sit." Clara looked at the corner. There was a smaller antique drafting table, set up angled so that she would be facing the wall, but he would have a clear view of her profile. A stack of leather-bound ledgers and a modern laptop sat on top of it. She walked over her movements stiff. Sitting down in the wooden chair was an ordeal. Her ribs ground together, and an involuntary gasp slipped through her teeth. She immediately clamped her mouth shut, glaring at the blank wall in front of her. Jason didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer a cushion. "Open the red ledger." His voice came from behind her, steady and rhythmic. Cross-reference the invoices in the blue folder with the entries from October. The amounts won't match. Clara opened the heavy book. The pages smelled of dust and old ink. She opened the folder. "If they don't match, what am I looking for?" "A pattern," Jason said. "The North End fish suppliers are skimming. They think they're hiding it in the weight discrepancies of the ice. Find out exactly how much they've stolen over the last 3 months." Clara stared at the columns of numbers. She was a waitress. She knew how to balance a cash register, not how to audit a Mafia supply chain. But the numbers were just numbers. It was math. Simple, brutal math. "If I find the discrepancy," Clara asked, her voice quiet in the heavy air of the room, "what happens to the supplier?" The scratching of Jason's pen stopped. "Do not ask questions about the end result of your work, Clara," Jason said. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried a density that made the air in the room feel instantly heavier. "You are an accountant. You find the numbers. I handle the consequences." Clara turned in her chair, wincing as her torso twisted. She looked at him. He was already looking at her. His glasses pushed up slightly. "I just want to know if my math is going to get someone killed," she said, her tone devoid of the subservience he was used to. Jason held her gaze. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the corner. "Your math," Jason said slowly, enunciating every syllable, "will determine if they owe me money or if they owe me blood. If you make a mistake, I might collect the wrong one. I suggest you carry the one correctly." A cold sweat broke out on the back of Clara's neck. The banality of it was terrifying. Men lived or died, based on whether she caught a hidden decimal point in a column of frozen cod shipments. She turned back to the desk. Her hands were shaking slightly. She gripped the edge of the table to steady them. They worked in silence for 2 hours. The only sounds were the ticking clock, the rustle of paper, and Clara's occasional sharp intake of breath when she shifted her weight too quickly. She reached across the desk for a calculator. She stretched too far. A blinding, white-hot tear of pain ripped through her right side. Clara dropped the calculator. It clattered loudly against the wood. She doubled over, clutching her ribs, a choked, wet sound escaping her throat as tears involuntarily sprang to her eyes. The pain was suffocating. She couldn't draw a breath. She heard the squeak of Jason's leather chair, the heavy, deliberate thud of his footsteps crossing the room. She braced herself, expecting him to drag her up by her good arm, to tell her to stop being dramatic and get back to work. Instead, a small, white plastic bottle slid across the smooth wood of her desk, bumping against the fallen calculator. Clara opened her eyes, gasping for air. She looked at the bottle. Ibuprofen. Maximum strength. Jason was standing next to her desk. He didn't touch her. He didn't lean in. "Take 3, he said, his voice entirely flat. 2 won't touch the inflammation, and keep your left arm closer to your body when you reach. You're pulling the serratus muscle." Clara stared at the pills, then slowly looked up at him. "You know a lot about getting beaten up." "I know a lot about anatomy," Jason corrected smoothly. He turned and walked back toward his desk. "I need that total by noon, Clara. If the pain is too distracting, we can arrange for you to work out your debt in the kitchen washing dishes. But I imagine standing over a sink for 12 hours won't do your ribs any favors." It wasn't a threat. It was a purely logical assessment of her options. Clara unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers. She dry swallowed 3 pills, the chalky taste burning the back of her throat. "I'll have it by noon," she muttered, pulling the ledger closer. "Good," Jason said from his desk, the scratching of his pen resuming. "Because at 12:30, we have a meeting with the fish supplier." Clara's pen froze on the paper. She stared blindly at the numbers, the reality of her new life locking its jaws firmly around her throat. She wasn't just paying off a debt. She was becoming part of the machine. At exactly 12:30, the heavy oak door opened. The man who walked in smelled aggressively of stale brine, cheap aquatic cologne, and nervous sweat. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a rubber-coated jacket that squeaked with every step. Clara didn't look up from her drafting table, but she felt the shift in the room's air pressure. "Mr. Vitiello," the man boomed. His voice was too loud for the soundproofed office, forced and hearty. "A pleasure as always. Got the new shipment out back. Beautiful yellowfin today." "Sit down, Sal," Jason said. He didn't look up from his own paperwork. Sal hesitated, the squeak of his jacket amplifying his uncertainty. He took the chair opposite Jason's desk. He didn't look at Clara. To him, she was just a piece of furniture, a secretary blending into the mahogany and leather. Clara kept her head down, her eyes glued to the meticulously printed numbers she had just finalized. Her ribs were a dull, throbbing band of heat across her chest, barely muted by the ibuprofen. Her palms were slick with cold sweat. "We're doing a review of the autumn quarter, Sal," Jason finally said, setting his pen down. He leaned back, lacing his fingers together. The margins are thinning on the seafood platters. "Inflation, boss," Sal answered smoothly, waving a thick, calloused hand. "Fuel prices for the boats, the cost of ice. It's killing all of us." "Ice?" Jason repeated. The word hung in the air, cold and sharp. "Yes, ice is heavy." Sal shifted in his seat. "Right. It's heavy." Jason turned his head slightly toward the corner of the room. "Clara." The sound of her name made her stomach violently drop. She swallowed the copper taste pooling in her mouth and forced herself to sit up straight, ignoring the sharp pull in her shoulder. She picked up the sheet of paper from her desk. "Yes, Mr. Vitiello." Her voice sounded hollow, like it belonged to someone else. "Read the total discrepancy for October through December." Clara looked at Sal. The fishmonger was finally looking at her, his brow furrowing as he took in her battered face. He looked from her swollen eye down to the paper in her trembling hand, and then a slow, creeping realization began to drain the color from his cheeks. $14,520, Clara read. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that, at least. Sal let out a harsh, barking laugh that held absolutely no humor. "What is this? Who the hell is she? Some battered broad. You pulled off the street to check my math. I've been supplying this kitchen for 5 years, Vitiello. And for the last 3 months, you've been logging the weight of the ice melter's product," Jason said. His tone remained perfectly conversational. $14,000 worth of water, Sal. That's a lie. She's stupid. She carried a 0 wrong. You're going to trust some bruised-up waitress over me." Sal's voice was rising thick with panic and misplaced bravado. He leaned forward, slamming his hand flat on Jason's desk. It happened so fast, Clara's brain struggled to process the sequence of events. Jason didn't shout. He didn't stand up. He simply moved his right hand. He grabbed Sal's thick wrist, twisting it inward with a vicious torquing motion, and slammed the man's elbow down onto the hard mahogany surface. With his left hand, Jason picked up the heavy brass base of his desk lamp. He brought it down directly onto Sal's outstretched fingers. The sickening crack of bone was loud enough to echo. Sal shrieked. It was a high, reedy sound that tore out of his throat as his knees buckled, sending him crashing to the floor, tethered to the desk only by Jason's iron grip on his wrist. Sal writhed, sobbing openly, his shattered fingers splayed out at grotesque angles on the pristine wood. Clara stopped breathing. She gripped the edges of her drafting table so hard her fingernails dug into the wood. Nausea clawed at her throat. She couldn't look away from the blood beginning to smear across Jason's desk. "I trust her math, Sal," Jason said, quietly, looking down at the weeping man. "Because she has no reason to lie to me. You do." "I'll pay it." Sal sobbed, his forehead resting against the floorboards. "I'll pay it back. I swear to God, Jason, please." "You will pay back 20,000, Jason corrected smoothly. He released Sal's wrist. The man collapsed completely, cradling his ruined hand against his chest. "You have until Friday. If you are short a single dime, I won't use the lamp next time. I'll use the cleaver in Leo's kitchen." Jason looked up. He met Clara's eyes across the room. She was entirely rigid. The horror must have been radiating off her, but Jason's expression remained an unreadable flat mask. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a monogrammed handkerchief, and wiped a speck of blood from the brass lamp base. "Get out of my office, Sal," Jason said. The fishmonger scrambled backward, kicking the door open with his foot, too terrified to use his good hand. He stumbled down the hallway, leaving a trail of high, breathless whimpers behind him. The heavy door swung shut. The lock clicked. The silence rushed back in thicker and more suffocating than before. The ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. Clara stared at the smear of blood on the mahogany. You broke his hand." "I broke 2 fingers, Jason corrected, tossing the soiled handkerchief into the trash. "He has 8 left to count his money with. Over $14,000. "Over disrespect," Jason said, his voice hardening. He finally stood up, walking around the desk toward her. Clara instinctively pressed her back against her chair. "He thought he could steal from me because I wouldn't check. He thought he could insult you in my office." He stopped beside her desk. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked tired. "You did the math perfectly, Clara. I was the trigger," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "I gave you the number and you broke his bones." Jason leaned down, resting one hand on the edge of her table. He was close enough that she could smell the clean, sharp scent of his soap, completely masking the smell of the violence he had just committed. "You are not the trigger. You are the lens. You just showed me what was already there," Jason said, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Do not pity men who dig their own graves and expect you to fall in instead. Do you understand?" Clara looked at the cold, absolute certainty in his face. She realized with a terrifying clarity that he wasn't trying to scare her. He was trying to teach her. "I understand," she breathed. "Good." Jason straightened up. "Take your lunch break. Leo made risotto. 2 weeks bled into 3. November turned into a bitter, biting December. Clara's world shrank to the square footage of the restaurant. Her universe consisted of the sterile, cedar-scented apartment upstairs, the loud, chaotic kitchen where she ate her meals in the corner, and the heavy silence of Jason's office. Her face was healing. The violent purple around her eye had faded to a sickly mustard yellow, and the cut on her lip was nothing more than a thin, pale scar. The ache in her ribs had dulled from a sharp stab to a low, persistent throb. She was adapting. That was the most terrifying part. She was no longer jumping when the heavy oak door slammed shut. She stopped wincing when Jason's men, broad, quiet men with heavy coats and broken noses, came in to drop off thick manila envelopes. She simply recorded the numbers, balanced the books, and handed the ledgers back to Jason. She was efficient, invisible, except she wasn't invisible to him. It was past midnight on a Thursday. The restaurant was closed, the street outside silent beneath a fresh layer of snow. Clara was at her drafting table, rubbing her tired eyes as she cross-referenced the liquor inventory. Jason was at his desk. He wasn't working. He was drinking a glass of neat scotch, watching her. He did that sometimes. When the ledgers were closed and the phone stopped ringing, the room would fall entirely still, and Clara would feel the heavy, physical weight of his gaze. It was never leering. It was analytical, like he was trying to solve a complex equation in his head. "You need new glasses," Jason said suddenly, his deep voice breaking a 2-hour silence. Clara blinked, looking up. "I don't wear glasses." "You're squinting. You've been squinting at that column for 10 minutes. He pointed out, taking a slow sip of his amber liquor. "I'll have an optometrist come to the apartment tomorrow." "No," Clara said quickly. It was a knee-jerk reaction. She hated the doctors he brought in. They never asked questions. They just examined her in complete, terrified silence, and left. "I don't need glasses. The font is just small. I prefer my employees to be able to see." "I can see fine," she snapped, frustration suddenly bubbling over. She closed the ledger with a heavy thud. "What I can't see is the sun, Jason. I haven't been outside this building in 22 days. Jason set his glass down. The ice clinked softly. He didn't reprimand her for using his first name. She had started slipping it in a week ago, testing the boundaries of her cage. He had allowed it. "It's 20 degrees outside. You aren't missing anything," he replied evenly. "I'm missing my life." Clara pushed her chair back and stood up. She crossed her arms over her chest, ignoring the faint twinge in her ribs. "I've paid off $3,000 of the debt. I'm doing the work, but I'm going crazy in here. Let me walk around the block. Let me go to a real grocery store." "No." The word was absolute, a wall of stone. "Jimmy O'Connor hasn't made a peep," Clara argued, taking a step toward his desk. "Your men said he's hiding in South Boston. He doesn't care about me anymore." "Jimmy is a rat," Jason said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Rats don't care about anything until they are cornered. Right now he is losing territory, he is losing face, and he knows I am the reason why. If you walk out that door and his men spot you, you become leverage. I am not leverage. I'm an accountant. You are mine," Jason stated. The air in the room seemed to vanish. He stood up. The relaxed posture disappeared, replaced by the coiled, predatory stillness that Clara had seen the night he broke Sal's fingers. He walked around the desk, closing the distance between them until he was standing less than a foot away. Clara had to tilt her head back to look at him. She forced herself not to step backward. "You think this is a prison?" Jason said, his voice dropping to a low, rough murmur. He raised his hand. Clara instinctively held her breath, but he didn't strike her. He brushed his knuckles lightly against her cheekbone, right over the fading yellow bruise. His skin was warm. The touch was terrifyingly gentle. "You think I keep you here to punish you?" Clara swallowed hard. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. "You keep me here because you bought me." Jason's jaw clenched. His thumb traced the line of her cheek, a stark contrast to the violence those hands were capable of. "I keep you here because out there you are prey," he said, his dark eyes searching hers. "You let a weak man put a $10,000 bounty on your head. You let thugs beat you on a kitchen floor. You don't know how to survive the city you live in, Clara. And you're teaching me." She challenged, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "By locking me in a tower with a ledger." "I am securing the perimeter," he corrected. His hand dropped from her face, but he didn't step back. The heat radiating off his chest was palpable. "Until you understand how my world works, until you can see the threats before they kick in your door, you stay inside the perimeter." Clara stared at his chest, at the crisp white shirt and the dark silk tie. She was furious. She was suffocating. But beneath the anger, buried deep in the bruised, exhausted core of her, was a treacherous, sickening warmth. No one had ever secured a perimeter for her. Her whole life had been exposed, vulnerable to the whims of bad men and worse luck. Jason was a monster, yes, but he was a monster standing between her and the dark. "And when will I understand?" Clara asked quietly, finally looking back up into his eyes. Jason looked down at her. The clinical detachment in his gaze was gone, replaced by something heavier, something deeply possessive that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. "When you stop asking to leave," he answered softly. He held her gaze for a long, agonizing second, the silence stretching taut between them. Then he turned and walked back to his desk, picking up his scotch as if nothing had happened. "Go to sleep, Clara. We have to audit the dock shipments tomorrow." Clara stood frozen in the middle of the office. She looked at the heavy oak door, and then she looked at the man behind the mahogany desk. For the first time since she had taken the brass key, she didn't want to run. She just wanted to survive the burn. January brought a cold that felt personal. It seeped through the brickwork of the restaurant, chilling the floorboards, and making the heavy oak door of the office warp slightly in its frame. Clara was in the kitchen. It was 3 p.m, the dead zone between the lunch rush and dinner prep. The line cooks were out back smoking. Leo was in the walk-in freezer. Clara was standing near the stainless steel prep tables, a clipboard in hand, counting massive tins of imported olive oil. She felt settled. The bruised ribs were a memory. The limp was gone. She wore the severe black and white clothes like armor, her hair pulled back tightly. She knew the inventory. She knew the margins. She knew exactly how much money Jason Vitiello laundered through the wine distributor. She was tracing a line of numbers with her pen when the alley door banged open. It wasn't the delivery driver. It wasn't the line cooks. The air pressure in the kitchen dropped instantly, sucking the warmth out of the room. Clara turned. 3 men stood in the doorway. They weren't wearing the tailored coats of Jason's crew. They looked ragged, wired eyes darting frantically. The smell of cheap amphetamines, stale sweat, and cold exhaust flooded the space, overpowering the scent of basil and roasting bones. The man in the center raised a sawed-off shotgun. Clara didn't scream. The panic didn't paralyze her. It focused her. She had spent 2 months studying violence from a safe distance, watching Jason dissect threats in the quiet of his office. She knew exactly what this was. Jimmy O'Connor was out of money, out of time, and out of his mind. This was a suicide run. "Where is he?" The man with the shotgun barked his finger, trembling on the trigger. Clara dropped the clipboard. It clattered loudly against the tile. At the same moment, she threw her weight to the left, diving behind the heavy stainless steel bulk of the commercial stove. The shotgun roared. The sound was a physical blow, a concussive wave of heat and noise that punched the breath out of her lungs. Ceramic plates shattered above her head, raining sharp white shards down onto her shoulders. The smell of cordite, sharp metallic and burning, filled her nose. "Find the boss, burn the place," another voice yelled over the ringing in her ears. Footsteps pounded against the tile, heavy and chaotic. Clara pressed her back against the hot metal of the stove, her hands gripping her knees. She was unarmed. She was trapped. But as a man's heavy work boots rounded the corner of the prep table, moving toward her, she didn't cower. She reached up blindly, grabbing the handle of a heavy cast-iron skillet, resting on the dead burner above her, and swung it downward with everything she had. The heavy iron connected with the man's kneecap. The bone cracked with a wet, heavy snap. He screamed, dropping a handgun, as he collapsed onto the tiles, thrashing in agony. Clara scrambled backward, her hands sliding on a slick pool of spilled olive oil, trying to reach the dropped gun. Then the heavy oak door at the end of the hallway kicked open. Jason didn't shout a warning. He didn't ask questions. Two sharp, deafening cracks echoed through the kitchen. The sound of a high-caliber pistol fired with absolute mechanical precision. The man with the shotgun jerked backward, his chest caving in as he hit the aluminum refrigerator door, sliding down to the floor, dead before he stopped moving. The third man turned to run. Jason fired a third time. The man pitched forward into the alley, landing face first in the dirty snow. Silence slammed back into the kitchen, heavy and ringing. The only sound was the wet, ragged groans of the man with the shattered knee on the floor and the hum of the walk-in freezer. Clara sat on the floor, breathing in short, harsh gasps. Her hands were shaking violently now. The adrenaline was leaving her, replaced by a cold, numbing shock. Jason walked into the kitchen. He was holding a matte black pistol, the barrel pointed firmly at the ground. He didn't look at the dead man by the fridge. He didn't look at the bleeding man in the alley. He walked straight to Clara. He knelt on the slippery, oil-slicked tile, ruining the trousers of his expensive suit. He dropped the gun onto the floor and reached for her. His hands were completely steady. They gripped her shoulders hard and anchoring, pulling her out from behind the stove. "Where are you hit?" Jason demanded. His voice was a harsh, rasping demand, stripped of its usual smooth control. His dark eyes darted over her face, her neck scanning the white shards of ceramic, dusting her clothes. "I'm not—" Clara gasped out, her teeth chattering. "I'm not hit!" Jason's hands slid up to her neck, his thumbs pressing against her jawline. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling against hers. He stared into her eyes, looking for the lie, looking for blood. When he found none, a long, ragged exhale left his lungs. He looked down at the man whimpering on the floor, then at the heavy iron skillet Clara had dropped. Jason looked back at her. The violent feral tension in his jaw slowly relaxed, replaced by something deep and terrifyingly heavy. "You didn't run," he murmured, the words barely audible over the ringing in her ears. "There wasn't a perimeter," Clara whispered, back her voice shaking. Jason's grip tightened. He pulled her forward, burying his face into the curve of her neck. He smelled like gunpowder, expensive wool, and a dark, volatile heat. He held her there on the kitchen floor, surrounded by shattered porcelain and bleeding men holding on to her like she was the only solid thing in the room. 3 hours later, the kitchen was clean. Leo had come out of the freezer, taken one look at the bodies, and picked up a mop. Jason's men had arrived in unmarked vans. The dead were gone. The wounded man was gone. The health inspector would never know. Clara was sitting in the leather armchair in Jason's office. She had showered upstairs, scrubbing the smell of cordite out of her hair, but her hands still felt cold. Jason sat behind his mahogany desk. The pistol was gone. In its place was a thick stack of $100 bills and the heavy red ledger. He opened the ledger to the back page. He took his fountain pen and drew a single thick black line through Clara's name. Jimmy O'Connor was sitting in a running car 2 blocks down, Jason said. His voice was back to its flat conversational baseline, but the air in the room felt different. The tension wasn't hostile anymore. It was expectant. My men found him. He won't be returning to the North End. He won't be breathing anywhere at all. Clara stared at the red book. He's dead. He breached my house, Jason said simply. He closed the ledger. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. He picked up the stack of cash and tossed it onto the coffee table in front of Clara. $10,000, Jason said. Your debt was to Jimmy. Jimmy is gone. I absorbed his territory tonight. The math balances. Clara looked at the money. The green paper looked fake in the dim light of the desk lamp. What is this? Severance, Jason replied. He leaned back in his chair, watching her intently. You're paid in full. The threat is neutralized. You can pack your things. My driver will take you anywhere in the state you want to go. You have a clean slate, Clara. She should have felt relief. This was what she had fought for. 2 months ago, she would have grabbed the cash run out the door and never looked back. But looking at the money, all she felt was a hollow, sickening drop in her stomach. She looked up at Jason. He was perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask. But his eyes were dark, tracking her every breath. He was testing her. He had secured the perimeter, he had taught her the rules, and now he was leaving the gate wide open to see if she would walk out. Out there she was a waitress with a bruised past. Out there the world was chaotic, random, and cruel. In here the violence had rules. In here the math balanced. In here a man who broke bones to collect a debt had knelt in spilled oil to check her for bullet wounds. Clara stood up. She ignored the stack of cash on the table. She walked slowly across the room, the heels of her loafers clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. She stopped at his desk. She reached out and placed her hand flat on the closed cover of the red ledger. Who is going to do the South Side inventory? Clara asked. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Jason's eyes flicked from her hand to her face. A muscle ticked in his jaw. The South Side numbers are complicated. They require someone who understands the margins. I understand the margins, she said, holding his gaze. I understand exactly what it costs. Jason stood up slowly. He didn't walk around the desk this time. He just leaned forward, resting his hands on the mahogany, bringing his face inches from hers. If you stay, Jason said, his voice dropping to a low, rough hum that vibrated in the quiet room. There is no severance. There is no driver waiting to take you away. You don't get to close your eyes when the ledgers get bloody. Clara didn't flinch. She leaned in, closing the final inch between them, until she could feel the heat of his breath against her lips. I stopped closing my eyes the night you brought me here, she whispered. Jason let out a harsh, ragged breath. His hand came up his fingers, wrapping around the back of her neck, dragging her across the desk. His mouth crashed into hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was possessive bruising, tasting of scotch, and a dark, territorial desperation. It was a seal on a contract. Clara gripped the lapels of his suit, pulling him closer, kissing him back with a fierce answering heat. The coldness in her bones finally melted, replaced by the dangerous, consuming fire of the man holding her. She wasn't a captive anymore. She had chosen the cage.